So while he's getting that pulled up, I'm really curious, just for the room, how many of you are SDR, BDR people? How many of you are managers? Okay, and any enablement folks in the room? Nice, people, all right. All right, so like we were saying before, I started a company called Enablement about a year ago or so, and I found it really important that this space of enablement is really becoming a thing, right? It's a big thing, and it wasn't 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And so with as much that's been happening in this space, companies are having a very hard time finding talented, proven sales enablement folks. And so I help companies find those people. So that's what the company does. So what's been, and by the way, is the slide over here? Yeah. So so today for this talk, I kind of have a somewhat bold ambition, and I'm hoping you guys are cool with this. I want every one of you to fundamentally change some of how you enable SDRs in your organization. And because what I want to just talk to you about is what's happening out there and some best practices you can take back to your organizations. So there is some irony because this session is about best practices. The one next door is called the fallacy of best practices. So you are the optimists of the crowd. They are the pessimists. But I want to highlight some things that are really important. So when I started the company, I was talking to a lot of people in enablement, and really closer to 300 people now that I've talked to about their roles in their companies. And the bad news is little to nobody is saying my priority are the SDRs. It just doesn't happen. And no one's saying that's my primary thing. And the truth is it's not going to get better. So that's the bad news. So what I want you to come away with from today is things that you can do to ride the coattails of what the rest of enablement is happening in your company and things to take back to get going in your company. So that's what I want to do. In terms of level setting, I want to talk about modern enablement because I mentioned before it's changed a lot. Just kind of throw out some words. When you think modern enablement, what do you guys think about? Just throw out some words. What's that? Tech stack. What else? One-on-one coaching. One-on-one coaching. Data. This side's asleep. Productivity. What else? What's the last one? Messaging, yes. So there are a lot of things I think about. I want to talk about, for a couple of minutes, about academically, like, this is modern enablement. I want to kind of break this down, and then I'm going to get into the things you take away. So first and foremost, let's all agree it has evolved, right? 10 years ago, it wasn't a thing. Now it's a thing. And with this, if your companies are still doing enablement with 3-ring binders and people in classrooms all the time and flying all over the world, that is more old school. And I challenge you guys that you've got to let your programs evolve. And so if you're in one of those companies, please be aware you're missing a lot and you really want to go back and take part in that. The second big thing that's been a driver for a lot is about technology, right? Every one of us is tethered to these things 24/7. And what's remarkable is they can watch videos, you can record videos, you can do podcasts, you can download files. If you have later versions, you can make phone calls to other people with these things if you know how to work them that way. There's a lot that's been happening on these devices, and enablement really should be leveraging these technologies. Otherwise, you're missing an opportunity to do a lot of things that will empower your organization. One of the things I highlight a lot is about peers and peer-to-peer learning. And what I'll tell you from my experience is the companies that do it best, they leverage peer-to-peer learning in a very big way. They find a way to facilitate that interaction at scale. They make it as frictionless as they can for rep to learn from rep. Because I think all of us instinctively know that we trust our peers more than we trust somebody in training or enablement, even maybe a person in marketing, because we walk in the same shoes. We have a shared experience. And so as much as you can have peer-to-peer learning happening across your organization, you're really doing something right. So philosophically, very important underpinning. Same with managers. So a bunch of you guys are managers of people. What I'll tell you is if you're a manager of SDRs or BDRs, you are a deputized member of the enablement staff. And what I mean is, if you're not part of enablement, then that's a problem, because Enablement cannot and will not happen effectively if the frontline managers are not actively involved. Does that make sense? You guys involved? Raise your hand if you're involved in enablement as a manager. Yeah, some, but not enough. My challenge to you, and please take this back, is you've got to be part of the enablement team by extension. You've got to go first, you've got to lead by example, and you've got to vocally say, this is important. If you do not do that, people will not follow you, and things are dead. And so you've really got to be an active, vocal champion, cheerleader, if you will, of all the enablement. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful. That's why 10, 15 years ago, it was all about, people were getting 60% participation, 70% participation. It was terrible. Now, when you do it right, it's almost at 100% because you have the smart way of leading by example and trickling down across an organization. So very essential underpinning to making enablement modern and making it work. The other thing that you want to think about a lot are about KPIs and metrics. So in a former life, I was a trainer, back when it was called training, and my version of success and my accountability was how many smiley faces I got on the surveys at the end of a classroom session. That was it. There was zero accountability. There was no attribution to outcomes that's happening in the sales organization, and that was a huge miss. And what I contend today is that modern enablement, it has that accountability. It has you can trace a line between what happens in enablement and what happens with the outcomes in the sales organization. And so it happens. I'll tell you a quick story. About a year or two ago, I was talking to a prospect, and they called us up and said, hey, I want to run a messaging certification. Can you help us? I said, sure, no problem. Why do you want to do that? And she said, well, we haven't done one in 6 months, and we're way overdue. I said, okay, but why do you want to run the program? Because it's been 6 months. And she wasn't connecting enablement to an outcome. She wasn't saying, I want to do this because I want to make an effect on the business. So what I would have loved for her to have said is, oh, you know what? We have a new competitor. Our messaging's not resonating. Our win rates are down to 38%. They used to be at 60%. So we think with the new messaging, we'll start winning more again and get up to closer to 50 to 60%. That's what I wanted to hear is a metric-based, outcome-based conversation about enablement. And I think part of the legacy of old school training compared to new enablement is it wasn't KPI-based. And so when I talk to people all the time about their backgrounds, they struggle to ground enablement in metrics. They struggle to figure out, how do I connect these two things? And it's hard. I'm not contending it's an easy thing to do, but you really got to work at it. I'm going to post a video and do an article next week of some research I'm doing. And one of the amazing things I'll share with you is people who are really good at enablement, they talk about metrics a lot. Those who are really, really good talk about it twice as much. They're metric obsessed. And so as you think about your organizations and what's happening there, find the metrics you can affect and go deep on those things and never let go. They are essential to being successful. This is how you win more budget for tools. This is how you win budget for headcount. This is what's essential. Otherwise, it's very hard to make a case to a CFO with some smiley faces on a survey form. It's reality. The last thing I'll touch on is it really needs to be holistic. And what I mean by that is enablement is meant to be an organization-wide thing. And so all the things that are happening with the account executives is relevant for the SDRs, the BDRs, the sales engineers, the customer success managers. There's a lot of stuff you can do across the organization to enable the organization. And so don't ever lose sight from the fact that you want to ride coattails and share things as much as you can. And I get into my next couple of slides here as I dive down very specifically. What I want you to think about is what can you steal from the organization and use as SDRs if you don't have the focus that you might want to have. All right, so this is where it gets real. So what I want you, the things that you should be getting from your enablement team. So again, some things you may be getting, some things you may not be getting, but I want you to walk away demanding these things. You guys with me on this? It's important stuff. So first thing, somewhere in your organization, you've got to find some videos, some recordings of the best pitches you have. by vertical, by persona, by industry, however you guys divide those things up, you have to have them. They may exist with your sales team. If they do, steal them. I'm a huge advocate of stealing as much as you can, as often as you can. You have to have it. And so have it broken down by each of the personas and figure out which ones are the best. And I'm a huge believer in certifications. So getting every SDR, BDR able to stand and deliver these pitches. You're on the phone all day long. All you do is pitch and deliver messages. So you've got to have it down cold and have a persona base and all that stuff. And so if this doesn't exist in your organizations, find somebody who can do it and get it recorded. Deputize them to help you out and give that pitch by vertical, by persona, whatever your thing is in your organization, and have them on demand. Have them on demand and certify people on these pitches. Because if you don't, they're not going to have the fluency and they're not going to have the comfort in delivering these pitches. And if you do it right, they'll nail it. So find these things in your organization and steal them and make sure everyone can deliver them. In a similar way, the second thing is all about customer stories. So who here does customer stories in your organizations? So maybe a third-ish. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of, as SDRs, of knowing the stories. And when I was at Salesforce earlier in my career, I would say things like, oh, IBM's a customer. Impressed? And no one cared. And what I was doing wrong back then was I wasn't telling the story of IBM. And so it should be something like, we got as a customer IBM, these were the challenges they were having, here's what they're doing on our platform, and here's what now is happening, with some quantifiable answer there. And having an arc to that story. And so again, as people on the front lines who have this much time to get people's attention, you got to have those stories and have them where they're applicable to the person you're talking to. So customer stories broken down by the verticals that you have in your organizations and or by personas. And again, I'm a big believer in certifications, of having every single SDR in your company able to stand up here like this and tell X number of stories of your customers. If you're not doing that, you are sorely, sorely missing out. And again, when I say certification, you can do it with brute force and sort of as best as you can, or there are technology options out there. However you have to do it, whatever it takes, MacGyver it, but get it done, and find a way to certify your teams on these stories. So the other thing, as people on the front lines, is lots of objections, right? And I suspect any person here, if I said, list for me the top, 5 to 10 most commonly heard objections or FAQs you hear on the phones. And you could all be like, yeah, I got this, no problem. You know what they are just because you hear them all the time. And so what I've seen happen really effectively, what I strongly believe is, especially for frontline folks who are having objections all day long, is crowdsource from the team, what are those top objections, and then figure out what is the gold standard response to each of those objections. Okay, so whether it comes from marketing or from people on the front line in sales, wherever it comes from, you need to get that. And then again, you want to certify them on these objections because they're roadblocks. And you got to get people to be very comfortable getting past these roadblocks every single time. And every rep, every single time, should not be able to trip over the same objections because you know how to solve them. So you got to get everybody solid at that. And I'll make a point here too, especially on this one. It's somewhat about the content, but it's also about how they say it, the intonation, the pausing, the way they say things so it doesn't come across as defensive. Like if you hear you're too expensive and you're on your heels, you're like, and you're trying to remember some value prop you learned when you started, you need to be able to give those things and talk about it in a very calm, mature way that is very credible with the person you're talking to. So again, it's figure out what the responses are and then get people comfortable. I feel like every person in their career has known that person who is just amazing and like they are the ninja Jedi. They can handle any objection without breaking a sweat. So how do they deliver the responses? And so you want to get those things captured, have them on a video library, and then certify. I talk a lot about this because the repetition is really important, and learning from your peers is even more important. I'll put in a plug here. So some of this technology I just acquired about maybe 2 or 3 months ago. I bought Chorus, who preceded me. Gong, they do a lot of the same things. Huge plug for what they're doing. They call it, was it Conversational Intelligence, is that right? The technology is phenomenal, and the ability to do really good coaching it's off the charts in a way that really never existed before. It does the recording, the transcription, and they even surface some highlights from the calls. And so from a coaching perspective, it is a must-have tool. What I'll talk about here is having those calls recorded where a manager or enablement person can say, this is a really good call, and start to curate the best calls from the reps. And when I say the best calls, I'm not saying ones where you're like, nailed it. I mean the ones where there were some headwinds. They asked some challenging questions. They threw you off your game, and you still managed to kind of like get through it. Those are the things you want people to hear how they're executed, because they've got to learn. You don't want to teach them just how when things go perfectly according to plan. That's great, but there's also like when things don't, and that's the real world. And so taking those best calls, getting them recorded, and then having people listen to them at scale is a great thing. I'll say one really interesting thing for those of you who are enablement. So I'm using Chorus, and I'm started to, when my people on my team talk to sales enablement folks to consider them for jobs, the calls are recorded, and I have Chorus basically surfacing insights on them on how good they are as enablement folks. So it listens for how often they talk about metrics, how often they talk about frontline managers. So usually these are for listening to your sales reps. I'm using to listen to the other person to qualify them and see how good they are at enablement. And so the technology is powerful, and it's reinforcing like there's certain things that the best enablement folks do. And so for the folks in the room, whether you have great resources to support you, or whether you're having to do it by brute force with YouTube private playlist and recording off of your phones, it doesn't matter how you do it, but it is so important that all of you start to get these things ingrained in your SDR programs. And if this is the backbone of what you do, you're in a good position. Because again, as I talk to people all the time, they're not saying, my VP of sales said focus so hard on the SDRs. Like, that's not happening enough. And so who here feels like you get the love from your enablement team enough? Yeah. There you go. That's my point exactly. They're great. Michelle is great. Everybody has great intentions, but they don't have the resources they always will need to do that. So it's up to you in the room. I'm officially deputizing all of you to take matters in your own hands and kind of shake some people and say, we need some help. And so if these pitches and the objections and the stories don't exist, find somebody to support you to get them built out. And then once you have those assets, you can go a long way with those things and your mobile phones. So just to wrap up, I want to leave some time for questions. So tomorrow, starting here is, number 1, get those best pitches. Number 2, get the customer stories. 3, the objection handling. And finally, calls and emails too that are successful, get those too. If you get those 4 things, that will take you a very, very long way. And that can be the underpinning of the rest of your program. So I ended early intentionally so I can open up for questions. What questions does the room have? Yeah.
So I'm the only SDR, and what would you say to the leadership who you think may not believe in sales enablement?
Yeah.
How would you kind of take that conversation to your manager?
So I'll paraphrase so the rest of them can hear it. So he's the only SDR. How do you take to the head of sales and say, we need more support, we need more resources? Is that right? For enablement. Yeah, I think there are 2 types of VPs of sales in the world, those who have had good enablement and those who haven't. Those who have understand the power of enablement. They know it's their leverage across the organization. They maximize it. If they've never had good, they've just had like trainers in the past, they can't appreciate. And so I would get them to be plugged into other VPs of sales who have strong enablement programs to hear what they're doing, because once you've had good enablement, you're obsessed with it. CEOs pay me to find the good enablement people because they understand how important it is. And so you need to get them to understand the power of enablement. And one of the things you can ask them is, how many A reps do we have versus B reps versus C reps? Like not SDRs, because it's just you, but like across the reps. If there's a bunch of A's, B's, and C's, there's a large disparity. And you don't want a disparity. You want people performing more closely, right? So how do you bring up the B's and C's closer to the A's? And so if you have that disparity, enablement allows you to move the rest of the B's and C's up towards the A's, and that has a very huge and fast ROI. In the very back.
So I'm building out certifications as we speak. Even knowing everything I need to know is hard. Do you have any resources or recommendations of where you can get a really well thought out certification process for all the different areas that we need to?
Yeah, so resources for certification was the shorthand of the question. So there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a Sales Enablement Society, and there's a lot of people in there, and if you ask a question, you'll get a ton of responses. So that's one easy place. There's another place called Sales Accelerators. A woman in Chicago named Allison Sword, S-W-O-R-D. She also has a member-only thing for enablement folks, and she has lots of templates in there. Great resource. Those are the ones, and there's a ton of vendors out there who have resources, but I would say start there with templates. If you can't find any good ones, ping me, because I have people who do have good ones. I can get some for you. Jimmy.
Hey, great to hear you, by the way. So, certifications are wonderful, but there's this kind of one and done kind of aspect to them, and being an SDR, BDR, it's a full contact sport, always going. What about ongoing coaching, right? Continuous training that the manager has to facilitate. So, any best practices you can share?
Yeah, so best practice for beyond this, how to keep the train going. So one of the worst things you can do as an enablement person is go up there and do a session and not be able to talk about what's next. And I think a very good best practice is to always have an enablement calendar for the year, or 6 months at a minimum, of it's end of the quarter, so we're going to be doing this. And so have a series of events that are happening and a cadence. If you don't have that, enablement will feel so much in isolation, like just a very static thing, versus something that we're doing as a motion for our go-to-market. And so I highly recommend having that calendar and having the enablement team with the heads of sales work in collaboration on what that calendar is, and then you execute. But if each thing is as a one and done thing, you're not going to get the momentum on that flywheel. You're never going to get the program going, on and on. There's a hand over there.
Is there any other technology that you'd recommend or say is necessary to be successful from an SDR enablement perspective, aside from your Gong and Force AI?
Yeah, I have a small bias, and I'll kind of be very forward with it. So I worked at a company called Saleshood, which is an enablement platform company. But companies like that, where you can record pitches, you can look at a library of pitches, there's those platforms out there that are very, very powerful. Part of the reason that enablement has become such a thing over the past 10 years is because there's a lot of investment in the technology in the space, and so there's a lot there. So I think there's a whole host of, they're not LMS tools, learning management systems. They're not that. They're this sort of next iteration that are more sales focused, and all of them have a lot of the same things of how do you share best practices, how do you practice things, how do you get feedback and get coaching and tie it back to metrics. A lot of these tools kind of play in that space, and I would always avoid the LMSs and always gravitate towards these sales-oriented tools, because if you're using an LMS, you're thinking like 1990, 1993 types of technology, and you're not taking advantage of all the new stuff that's happening. So LMS bad, sales platforms good. Did that answer your question?
Do you have any in particular?
I was saying, so there's sales, so there's LearnCore, there's Showpad, there's MindTickle, there's Lessonly, there's Level Jump. There's a bunch out there, and they all have different whistles and bells. So depending on what you need, I would say pick from that bucket. Those are the ones that are doing more modern sales enablement. There was another hand somewhere. Is that it? Guys, thank you. I'll be hanging around if you have questions about anything. But go enablement. And guys, please take it in your own hands and make enablement happen in your company if you don't have the support you need. Thanks.